Hey, construction enthusiasts. Before we dive into today's episode, a quick shout out to the OGCA Construction Symposium, the go-to event for industry leaders. This year, it's bigger and better, with an expanded education program, an interactive trade show, and exclusive networking opportunities. Join us at the Blue Mountain Resort and Conference Center from April 11th to 13th. Visit ogca.ca for details. Don't miss out on the OGCA Construction Symposium, where innovation meets industry excellence. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media Warren Frey, and we have a special two-part economic podcast series with our favorites and our economists, Alex Carrick, our chief economist, and Michael Guckes, our senior economist. And we're going to talk about a wide variety of trends that are going to and forces that are going to be hitting the economy in 2024. But we're going to start with sort of a place setting via Alex, the construction starts which just came out. So Alex, take it away.
Thank you, Warren. The outlook is really pretty good because the U.S. is just roaring along with its GDP numbers. The third quarter and the fourth quarter numbers were well above average. Canada, the growth rate, the GDP growth rate, isn't as high as it is for the United States, and the outlook is that 2024 probably will be more of a flat year. Just the same, there was a time when all the talk was about recession. But let's just think about the positives for this year. One of them is going to be that interest rates are going to begin to fall, probably in the second quarter. And so that'll be good for growth. And in Canada, there's a couple of things. So I want to talk about the positives before we get into the negatives. For Canada, there's a huge positive in terms of the population growth rate, which is really incredibly strong. It was plus 3% year over year in last year. And then there's two things that are going to happen that are going to dramatically begin to change the economic landscape in Canada. And one is the opening of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is almost complete. And that'll begin to ship Alberta oil to the coast for sale to Asian nations, where it's been locked in, having to go south through the whole history of the oil industry in Alberta. And the other is LNG Canada. Will likely be beginning to send liquefied natural gas to Asia as well. And they're going to really influence the economies of Alberta and British Columbia and the trade statistics for Canada. So there's a lot that's positive, but whenever you're at a conference or talking to clients, they will often say, well, what are the risks to the outlook? And there are certainly quite a number of major risks. So that's what we will try to get into today. Some of them are geopolitical, some of them relate to climate change, and then there's also financial risks, and there are supply side risks in terms of material and labor. So back to you, Warren.
Well, let's go big picture here. Like there certainly are big international geopolitical risks. Off the top of my head, Ukraine continues to be a sticking point for a bunch of reasons, and which works into domestic politics too, here and in the States. And also you've got the shipping lane problem and the Israel-Hamas conflict. All that stuff resonates through economically and acts as a risk. So maybe you guys could use your expertise, because that's about the extent of mine. So to explain how that affects the economies of both nations and other things that I might have not mentioned.
Well, Michael wrote a good column about the supply side issues, the global supply side issues. So, Michael.
So Warren brought up a really interesting point in his comments, talking about the Panama Canal, right? So, and climate change. Let's just start with climate change, right? Let's talk about what that means for the financials behind the construction industry. Couple of things, right? So we can start off with changing levels of water, right? So we all talk about rising sea levels and all these other things. And we talk about more events, more sort of catastrophic weather events happening, regardless of what type they are. I used to work in the insurance industry, so it's all about frequency of events and the severity of the events. And just looking at the insurance data alone, I don't even have to mention the word climate change. It doesn't matter, because if you just look at what's happening in the United States, for example, I don't have the Canadian data. Sorry, guys. But if you just look at the sheer number of major weather-related events that are causing billions of dollars worth of claims every year, right? That number keeps growing. And so what we see right now is we see these insurance companies that are essentially threatening to leave the market, right? We're seeing that in California. We're seeing that in the Southeast region, places like Florida, Georgia, coastal areas that are just really prone to hurricanes and whatnot. We're seeing a departure of these insurance firms. They simply cannot make the math work. And so you're getting, and this is a little bit anecdotal from what I've heard, but we are seeing CRE, commercial real estate insurance costs, just increasing 10, 20, 30%. In a worst case scenario, I would imagine, there might be one firm left, or maybe you're trying to find a firm to insure a property. But that's one of those many costs, right? It's one of those many small cuts that is going to affect the construction industry moving forward, right? As a building owner, developer, even a general contractor, anyone who has to buy insurance when they're either owning a building or working on it, right? It's another cost of operations that you have to be prepared for. And in fact, some of the experts I've been talking to say, a lot of their clients, a lot of people who come to them, they're getting caught off guard by this, right? They're using old pro formas from 2, 3, 4 years ago. And, interest rates have vastly changed. So that's changing their financials. Insurance is going up. Cost of labor is going up, right? As you mentioned, Warren, the Panama Canal actually has a drought problem right now, and that is restricting the number of ships that can transit through the Panama Canal. Now you got to go all the way around South America if you want to avoid that. But all of this is adding cost and delays to schedules. And again, it's all in some way, shape, or form related to climate change. And they're all small things right now. In the world of the construction expert, I think these are all small things. My insurance costs are going up. My ability to get goods and services has slowed down, or the cost of transit has simply increased for me. And we have to be aware that these things will continue to act like this. I think there's going to be a certain level of volatility among all these little things that add up to something substantial. And so that's where the climate change picture for me comes into view, is there's many small factors that sum up to something that really will have a larger impact on the industry. And we need, as experts, as construction leaders, you need to start figuring out, how am I going to create systematic and structural changes within my organization, start dealing with this stuff year after year after year.
And then with stuff like conflict, the Red Sea, that's another shipping route. So let's say the Panama Canal isn't working, then you got to go through the Red Sea, but then you've got people attacking, or you've got responses to it, which I can't blame Biden for doing that, but it is going to disrupt things so that there's knock-on effects, like you said.
Right.
In terms of, that's one, like logistics, that's a risk. And because we saw how bad that was in the global supply shortage situation. And the world shipping lanes are either through the Suez Canal or through the Panama Canal. And the Panama Canal's got this circumstance where drought is affecting, because the Panama Canal, the way it works is they actually go up to a lake and then they go down on the other side to the other ocean, which is kind of funny. But that lake it doesn't have the levels of water that it used to. And we're all trying to move towards more renewables. So we're trying to move towards more hydroelectric power, for example. And climate change is coming in there through whether or not there is the same potential to draw on hydroelectric power that there was in the past. For example, I mentioned that LNG Canada project. They think that that's going to be so successful in the first phase that they want to go ahead with the second phase. But they want that the first phase is powered by natural gas. Natural gas is used as the fuel source to cool down the gas to a liquid state. But they want to use electricity to cool gas to a liquid state in the second phase. And there's a considerable concern about whether there's going to be enough hydroelectric capacity in northwest British Columbia to do that. And everywhere there are lakes and rivers that are having a problem supplying the necessary electric power. And in terms of the supply routes globally, there is an index, and Michael's article talked about how the costs of shipping around the south of South America and the southern part of Africa, that they're having to do that because of the conflict with the Houthis and so on in the Middle East. That's driving up costs. There is something called the Baltic Dry Index. So I'm keeping a bit of an eye on the Baltic Dry Index, and I just like that because it's such a neat term. And it sounds so. I agree. It sounds so smart too. When
it sounds like a Cold War spy thing, actually.
Well, yeah, I know about the Baltic Dry Index. Well, there was a time when during that supply shortage stage, that Baltic Dry Index went right off the charts because it's an estimate of the cost of shipping container goods across the Pacific. And it's still quite restrained for the moment, but this whole podcast is about risks, and I'd keep an eye on the Baltic Dry Index.
And Michael, you've written about nearshoring and how it sounds like a good idea, but it's long term probably not going to work, and people won't go with it because it's just not cheap enough. So how is that a risk as well? People adopting it or not?
Yeah, well, I've worked. First of all, hang on. Let's be careful here.
Okay, yeah.
I think that there are lots of opportunities where reshoring makes sense. I get it. I've worked with a lot of people in manufacturing who will praise it, and they have good logic behind it. So let's
I don't mean to speak for you. Sorry about that. Please correct me at any point.
So one of the things, right? But think about it from this perspective, right? Just from a simple, how do we make that work, right? Reshoring requires, especially in the advanced economies that we're talking about, whether it's next level renewables or AI, electric vehicles, et cetera, right? These things require a bunch of different inputs, right? So capital is one, labor is one, materials is kind of the final one. I mean, this is really simplistic economics, right? But barring sort of intellectual capital laws and all that stuff, right? Those are the big three. And the challenge is that within our country, well, sure, within, I would even say North America, right? We have access to the capital. That's not a problem. But we don't have the workers. I mean, we just don't have enough people ready to go mine lithium. If we even have enough of those kinds of materials, the cobalts, the other specialty metals that are needed for high-powered magnets and all these things, right? So reshoring in some ways, where we don't run up against these limits is totally fine. And I get that, and I understand the push for those efforts. That's great. But I think we just need to be very much aware that there are certain things, and no matter how badly we want to reshore something, if we don't have the neodymium or whatever, I apologize for not being able to pronounce some of those fancy names from chemistry class that I've long forgotten. But if we don't have certain of the minerals, the chemicals, et cetera, available to us in Canada and the U.S. and Mexico, I mean, you just can't make them out of thin air, right? It's like the old saying: if you don't grow it, you have to mine it. We don't think about that all the time,
and we may not have it.
Yeah, and so that's the materials is the one really, I think, tricky part that can create some hard stops on the reshoring effort. The other one that I find is going to be an evolving challenge is the labor shortage. When we look at the demographics of our countries, the U.S. or I would say it's on the path to very significantly changing its immigration policy. That doesn't help, and we already are struggling to find enough qualified workers. The way that we're teaching our children, and the simple fact that we're not having as many children, right? The natural growth rate of our country of America, it's not what it needs to be. If we're going to bring back all these jobs, you're going to bring back all these jobs with no one to fill them. And we're already beginning to see that. And Alec and I, have talked about this for many months, if not well over a year now, that, really since COVID, we've seen the labor supply gap really collapse, because for decades, we had several million people always available to work. There were always several million more people available than there were jobs. And so you always had this cushion of labor. And since COVID, that has collapsed, right? We lost a lot of baby boomers, and they were some of the most valuable, skilled employees out there. They've now essentially, accelerated their retirements. They're gone. And ever since then, we just have been striving and struggling, right, to backfill those roles, plus bring on people for new roles that are being created. So I'm not going to say anymore, but because I think I've essentially belabored the point enough. But those are some hard things that I think executives and visionaries really need to be thinking hard about before we just say, hey, we're going to reshore everything, because you can't reshore everything. It's just not possible right now. So we have to be much more careful about that.
One of our topics later on, which I think I'm going to jump to right now, is the labor supply issue. We're going to talk about domestic politics, and it certainly ties into that, but let's save that for the next episode. Let's just talk about the pure economics of what you said about populations. Because I know in Canada, for instance, we've got a whole sort of back and forth happening where we need more people, but we've also got this housing crisis that is just, and then if you bring more people in, you got to build more houses, et cetera, et cetera. Once again, I've hit the limit of what I know what I'm talking about. So Alex, you take it away on that, economically speaking.
Well, the thing, though, for Canada really is the housing's a problem, but the population growth is just stunning. I mention this as often as I can because it really changes the way Canadians will think about themselves, I think, because I grew up for decades. There was a standard rule of thumb that the United States had a population that was 10 times the size of Canada.
Same here.
And you could always just take anything and divide it by 10 or multiply it by 10 and go back and forth between the two countries. But Canada's population, and what you can do is you can go to the clocks. There are population clocks on the internet, and look them up and see what the population estimate is right at this second. And if you divide them, the population ratio is now 8-1, and it's still very big, but that's a different Canada than 10-1. It really is. Anyway, so on the subject of labor, Canada is bringing in certainly an awful lot of refugees and immigrants and so on, and they are supposed to, there's qualifications that they have to have in terms of the capital that they bring and how quickly they can contribute to setting up firms and so on. So I think Canada's immigration policies are probably pretty good. Where there's a problem really for both countries in terms of shortages, so input shortages, is what Michael was saying, that if you need these things like chromite and what are some of the other ones anyway, cobalt and these raw earth materials and so on, and even nickel and copper. Yeah, even the really big ones, nickel and copper. In a lot of cases, you have to dig deeper, and you got to have mines, and you got to have mine approvals. And to dig deeper, there's a limit to how deep you can go with gas-powered equipment. So you got to have electricity to power equipment and so on. But the other thing is the approvals for these mines. Like the standard length of time to bring a new mine on is 7 years. And we're talking about transitioning to a new world of renewables over the next 25 years out to 2050. And the 7 years to bring on a mine is not going to get us there. So that's another risk to the outlook. And then I just say a few things about the geopolitical situation too. And because it's the standard ones, it's what's going on in the Middle East and so on. But there's also the risk of China and Taiwan.
Right.
The Chinese economy, see, we used to be able to count on the Chinese economy to kind of lift world growth.
Right.
Because they had GDP growth of 10%, 12%. Then it went back to 6%. And everybody sort of thought, well, 6% is pretty good. But they've got a lot of problems there now. So
population
it's more,
problems. Even though there's a billion of them, a lot of them are aging, basically.
well, yeah, their youth unemployment rate's over 20%.
Mm-hmm.
And they've got a real estate industry that has collapsed. Mm-hmm. And so at the most, they're going to get 4% growth this year. And why this is important for construction is because they used to demand so many commodities. And so that's taken some of the strength out of the commodity market. And so China and Taiwan, and there's the geopolitical situation is there's other parts of the world as well. And in Europe, for example, the head of the military in the United Kingdom, did you hear this? Where he was saying that they're taking this problem with Ukraine and Russia much more seriously than we are in North America. I mean, we take it seriously here, but the head of the military in the UK was talking very much about how there's got to be preparation for having a serious war, serious conflict with Russia. And it's kind of shocking to hear some of this stuff. So
yeah, it reminds me of a time a ways back when that was a going concern. So I don't want that to be one again. And like you said, in North America, we've always had, even back then, this luxury of the ocean that kept us at bay, and so it's tougher for us to wrap our heads around. But if you're essentially a neighbor, which England is, then it's a little closer to home.
Yeah.
I wanted to make one last comment. I wasn't sure where Alex was going to go, and I know we talked a little bit about labor, but can I make a final labor point now?
Please, Lou.
Okay.
Please, yeah.
So, February is Black History Month here in the U.S., and so I did some perusing of the data, as us economists are known to do, of African American data in construction data. You know what I'm trying to say, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things, and the reason that part of my interest in this is because on CNBC, a very young man, Mr. Herring, I think he has 1 or 2 years out of college here. He wrote an article on CNBC called "The Unemployment Rate of Black Men Rose in January, Underscoring Continued Inequality in Labor Markets." So that's the title of his article. And he goes on and he basically says, the unemployment rate for Black men for a 1 month period, looking at some December data released in January, I guess, so he's making a very sweeping claim based on 1 month of unemployment data. And I thought, someone needs to look into this a little deeper. So I did. From a construction perspective. It's really interesting what I found, because what I found out is that here in the US, the number of Black or African Americans in construction. That's this. I'm reading this right off of the data, which comes from the federal government here. You guys might not believe this, but in the last 10 years, the number of African Americans who have joined the construction workforce has increased by 48%.
Oh, okay.
I think that's fantastic. If you look at that in just the last 5 years, that number is not quite 20%. Okay. If you look at the white workforce, again, so I said 10 years, over the last 10 years, 48% increase in African Americans working in construction. Among white laborers, would you guys like to Terry a guess, throw me your best thought as to what that number is?
No idea,
0.
but I would guess there's a lot of retirements as well.
Yeah, so it's 17%. So over 10 years, number of white people in construction grew by 17%. It's almost 50% for African Americans. In the 5-year period, like I was saying, not quite 20% growth for African Americans in construction. Among whites, less than 1%. So, I think this is just a great opportunity for us to take a moment to remind construction executives and leaders out there that, some of the fastest, one of the fastest growing groups within the construction space is African Americans. I know that unfortunately, it seems like we get the only news that's ever seemingly published is about, they find an item on a work site that is a horrible item, should never, has no place to be on one of these work sites. That's all that the public ever hears is how bad, must construction be, because we're finding these things on construction sites that have no right to be there, no reason for their being there. But when we look at the data, when we get away from the headlines that I think are very misleading, there's so much great stuff going on in construction. And when you look at women in construction, and I've written about that previously, and how important the growth of women in construction has been since COVID. So I've written about that. And, here's some data. I haven't had a chance to write about it. But I just really wanted to get that out there as we're talking about some really key factors in the construction industry for 2024, just how great, the data has been trending over many years, not just 1 month, but a decade plus, for African Americans in the construction industry. So I just wanted to end on a really high note. I know we've been kind of all over the place today, and some of the stuff we've said is kind of discouraging.
I mean, completely anecdotally, and I'm sure Alex will back me up, although Alex is in Toronto, which is one of the most diverse cities in the world, so it might be a different perspective for him. But I could say over the 13 years I've worked and gone to different events and conferences, I have seen it change from mostly old white guys to a lot more women, a lot more people of color, a lot less gray hair, like a lot more young people, generally speaking. That could just be Vancouver, which is the bulk of what I've gone to, but I have definitely seen a change over the last decade or so. So I guess the next episode, we will tackle the domestic political stuff, and we also will tackle financial, the office, developer, and real estate sector, which has been in a bit of a tumult since the pandemic and continues to be. Are we bringing people back to the office or not? Who knows? But that will wait for next episode. So until then, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Alex, and I will see you both next time.